My dad yelled, "If you're so smart, pay your own bills," like he had finally said the thing he'd been holding back for years. His voice echoed through the kitchen, sharp and loud enough to make the cabinets vibrate slightly. It was the same kitchen I had grown up in, the same space where his word had always been treated like law. I stood there with my hands resting on the counter, noticing how calm I felt in that moment, as if my body had already accepted what my mind was only just catching up to. We weren't even fighting about something big. It never started big. That was the pattern. It began with something small and practical, something I thought was harmless to mention. I had pointed out that the electric bill looked higher than usual and that the utility company had changed their billing cycle again. I mentioned that the autopay might need to be updated to avoid late fees. I said it in the same careful tone I always used, neutral and factual, because I knew how easily he took correction as criticism. He didn't hear it as help. He heard it as defiance. He turned toward me, his face tightening, his jaw clenching in that familiar way. "You always think you know better," he snapped. "You're always correcting me like I don't know what I'm doing." His hand came down hard on the counter, the sound cutting through the room. My mom stayed quiet at the sink, her back turned, pretending to focus on the dishes. She had perfected the art of disappearing during moments like this. I tried to explain. I told him I was just trying to help, that I'd been managing the accounts for years, that I didn't want the power shut off again like it had been the winter before. I reminded him that I handled these things because it was easier for everyone. That was when he raised his voice and said it. "If you're so smart, then pay your own bills." The silence afterward felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. I didn't look at him. I stared at the small chip in the countertop near my hand and felt something inside me finally click into place. I nodded once, slow and controlled. "Okay," I said. The word sounded final, even to me. He scoffed, clearly expecting an argument, an emotional reaction, something he could push against. When none came, he shook his head and walked out of the kitchen, muttering about respect and gratitude. I didn't follow him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I went to my room and closed the door. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around at a space that no longer felt like home. The old posters, the dresser I'd never replaced, the closet door that never shut properly. It hit me then that I wasn't staying there because I needed to. I was staying because it was familiar, because leaving felt like more work than enduring. And suddenly, enduring felt harder than leaving. I pulled a duffel bag out from under the bed and set it on the floor. I didn't rush. I packed slowly and deliberately, choosing only what I needed. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop, my important documents. The things I'd always meant to organize someday. That day had arrived without asking my permission. As I packed, my hands didn't shake. My chest didn't feel tight. I wasn't panicking or running away. I was responding directly to what he had told me to do. If I was so smart, then I would take responsibility for myself completely. I texted a friend who lived across town in Columbus, Ohio, asking if I could stay with her for a while. She replied almost immediately, telling me to come over and not to worry about anything. I zipped the bag, slung it over my shoulder, and took one last look around the room. When I walked into the living room, my dad was sitting on the couch watching television like nothing had happened. He barely looked up when he saw the bag. "Where are you going?" he asked casually. "I'm moving out," I said. He laughed, short and dismissive. "You'll be back tomorrow," he said. "You always are." I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I walked out the front door and closed it behind me. That first night on my friend's couch felt strange and unreal. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to unfamiliar sounds, expecting fear or regret to creep in. Instead, I felt quiet. For the first time in a long time, my body wasn't bracing for the next outburst or criticism. The next morning, I sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and started looking at apartment listings. I wasn't frantic. I wasn't desperate. I knew one thing clearly: I wasn't going back. Within a week, I found a tiny studio apartment near German Village. The floors creaked, the kitchen was barely big enough to turn around in, and the windows looked out onto an alley. It wasn't impressive, but it was mine. I signed the lease, transferred utilities into my own name, and felt a strange sense of pride when I held the keys. I didn't call my dad. He didn't call me. At first, I think he enjoyed the silence. He probably assumed I'd realize how hard things were and come back humbled and apologetic. What he didn't realize was how much of his life I had been quietly holding together. For years, I had managed the online accounts. I set up autopay, tracked due dates, handled customer service calls when something went wrong. I did it without asking for credit and without reminding him, because it was easier than dealing with the fallout if things slipped. Now, I wasn't there. The first missed payment happened 2 weeks after I left. I didn't know about it at the time. I was focused on building my own routine, paying my own rent, learning how capable I actually was. I felt steadier every day. A month after I moved out, my phone rang early in the morning. I was standing in my small kitchen, brushing my teeth, when I saw his name on the screen. I paused before answering. "Why is the power off?" he asked immediately. That was when I knew this wasn't over yet. After that call, things didn't explode the way movies make you expect them to. There was no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation where years of resentment finally spilled out all at once. Instead, everything shifted into something quieter and far more uncomfortable. My dad didn't apologize for what he'd said that night in the kitchen, and I didn't ask him to. We both pretended, at least on the surface, that nothing fundamental had changed, even though everything had. When I told him I had moved out and transferred the utilities into my own name, there was a long pause on the line. I could hear him breathing, shallow and uneven, like he was trying to decide whether to be angry or confused. He asked me when I planned to fix the power issue, already assuming that I would step back into the role I had always played. I told him calmly that I wouldn't. I explained that the account was no longer mine, that he would need to call the utility company himself, set up an online profile, and handle the payment. I said it slowly, not to patronize him, but because I knew he wasn't really listening yet. He sighed heavily and said this was exactly what he meant when he said I didn't understand responsibility. The irony of that statement almost made me laugh, but I held it in. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him how many years I had quietly kept things running. I just repeated that I couldn't help him with it anymore. After we hung up, I sat at my small kitchen table and stared at my phone. I felt strangely detached, like I was watching the situation from a distance rather than being inside it. For the first time, his frustration wasn't my problem to solve. That realization felt both liberating and unsettling. Over the next few days, he called more often. Sometimes it was about the power bill. Sometimes it was about the internet not working. Sometimes it was about something else entirely, framed as a simple question that somehow always turned into a complaint. Each call followed the same pattern. He would ask for help. I would explain that I couldn't do it for him anymore. He would grow irritated, then quiet, then abruptly end the conversation. I started to notice how much of his confidence had depended on my presence. Without me quietly managing the details, things fell apart faster than either of us had expected. Late fees piled up. Notices arrived in the mail. Problems that had once been invisible suddenly demanded attention. He began to complain that everything was harder now, that companies made things too complicated, that customer service was useless. I listened without offering solutions. I didn't jump in to explain how to navigate the systems. I didn't correct him when he misunderstood something. I let the discomfort sit exactly where it belonged. At the same time, my own life was beginning to feel steadier. I developed routines in my new apartment that belonged entirely to me. I paid my rent on time. I cooked simple meals. I learned the sounds of the building and the rhythm of the neighborhood. Each small act of independence reinforced the same quiet truth. I had been capable all along. A few weeks after the power shut off, my dad invited me to come by the house to talk. His tone was different this time, less confrontational and more cautious. I agreed, curious but guarded. Walking back into that house felt strange. Everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The familiar spaces no longer had the weight they once did. When I sat at the kitchen table across from him, I noticed how tired he looked. Not physically exhausted, but worn down in a way I hadn't seen before. He started by talking about bills, about how expensive everything had gotten, about how unfair it felt to have to manage it all alone. He didn't say he missed me. He didn't say he was sorry. Instead, he framed his frustration as circumstance, as bad luck, as something happening to him rather than something he was responsible for. I listened quietly, hands folded in my lap, letting him talk himself into circles. When he finally paused, waiting for me to respond, I asked him a simple question. "Did you ever realize how much I was doing?" He looked at me, surprised, then defensive. He said of course he did, that he always appreciated my help, that he never took it for granted. The speed of his response told me everything I needed to know. I didn't argue with him. I didn't list examples. I just nodded and said, "Okay." That answer unsettled him. He kept talking, trying to fill the silence, explaining how stressful things had been since I left, how overwhelmed he felt, how he hadn't realized how complicated everything was. He stopped just short of admitting he needed me. I left the house that day feeling oddly calm. There was no satisfaction in seeing him struggle, but there was clarity. His authority had always depended on the idea that he was the one holding everything together. Without that illusion, he didn't quite know who he was. Over the next month, our conversations grew shorter. He stopped calling as often. When he did, his tone was more restrained, less commanding, almost careful. It was as if he had finally realized that pushing me too hard might make me disappear entirely. I noticed something else too. He began to hesitate before speaking to me the way he used to. The sharpness in his voice dulled. The automatic criticism softened. It wasn't growth exactly, it was adaptation. Meanwhile, I continued building my own life. I found a better job. I made friends in my neighborhood. I started saving for the first time without feeling guilty about it. I felt lighter, not because things were easy, but because they were mine. One evening, my dad called and told me he had finally gotten all the utilities sorted out. He sounded almost proud. I congratulated him, genuinely. There was a long pause after that. "I didn't realize how much you handled," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, but it was closer than he had ever come. I thanked him for saying it and ended the call. As I set my phone down, I realized something important. The power shift hadn't come from yelling or revenge, it had come from absence. From stepping away and letting consequences speak where words never could. The biggest change didn't come from anything my dad said after that. It came from what he stopped saying. He no longer raised his voice when we disagreed. He no longer spoke to me like I was a problem he needed to manage. Instead, there was hesitation, pauses, a carefulness that hadn't existed before. It was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. For most of my life, our dynamic had been clear. He gave direction, and I adjusted. He spoke, and I interpreted. He reacted, and I smoothed things over. That balance had always worked in his favor, even when it exhausted me. Now that I had stepped out of it, he seemed unsure how to interact with me at all. Our conversations became shorter and more deliberate. When he called, it was usually about something specific. A question about a bill. A letter he didn't understand. A form he needed to fill out. Each time, he asked instead of assuming. That difference mattered more than he probably realized. I answered when I wanted to. I explained only what I felt comfortable explaining. And when I didn't know something, or didn't want to get involved, I said so plainly. There was no guilt in it, no apology, just honesty. At first, that honesty made him uncomfortable. I could hear it in his voice. The way he rushed to justify himself. The way he backtracked when something came out too harsh. It was as if he was suddenly aware that his words had consequences beyond the moment. A few months after I moved out, he asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. Not because he needed help with something. Not because something had gone wrong. Just dinner. I hesitated before agreeing. Part of me worried that stepping back into that house would pull me into old habits. Another part of me wanted to see how it felt now. The house was quieter than I remembered. The TV wasn't blaring. The lights were dimmer. My mom greeted me with a soft smile, relief written all over her face. She didn't say anything directly, but I could tell she sensed the shift too. During dinner, my dad talked about his work. About the learning curve of handling everything himself. He mentioned mistakes he'd made, late fees he'd paid, things he'd had to figure out the hard way. He didn't frame them as jokes this time. He framed them as facts. I listened without interrupting. At one point, he stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. "You know," he said slowly, "I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on you." The words hung in the air. It wasn't a full apology. He didn't mention that night in the kitchen. He didn't repeat the words he had yelled. But it was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging his role in things. I nodded. "I know," I said. He looked relieved that I didn't push him further. After that dinner, our relationship settled into something new. Not warm, not distant, just honest. We spoke when we wanted to. We didn't perform for each other anymore. I stopped trying to earn his approval, and he stopped demanding it. There were moments when the old dynamic tried to resurface. A sharp comment here, a dismissive tone there. Each time, I didn't argue. I simply disengaged. I changed the subject. I ended the call. I left early. And each time he noticed, that was the real power shift. Not control, but choice. I had the choice to stay or leave, to engage or step back. to help or let him figure things out on his own. That freedom had nothing to do with money or intelligence. It came from no longer needing to prove anything. One afternoon, almost a year after I moved out, my dad called me unexpectedly. His voice was calmer than usual. "I just wanted to tell you," he said. "I finally got everything set up properly. Automatic payments, online access, all of it." "That's good," I said. There was a pause. I should have learned this a long time ago. This time, the words felt genuine. After we hung up, I sat by the window in my apartment and watched the street below. People walking, cars passing, life moving forward. I thought about how different things could have been if I had stayed. If I had continued absorbing his frustration and translating it into silence. Moving out that night wasn't about punishing him. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about choosing myself when I finally realized I was allowed to. I still love my dad. That never changed. What changed was the way I allowed myself to be treated. When I think back to that moment in the kitchen, the way he yelled and expected me to fold, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel distance, perspective, gratitude even, because that sentence pushed me into a life I should have claimed sooner. And the irony is, he taught me the lesson himself. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been told to stay small just to keep the peace, you're not alone. Some changes don't happen through arguments, but through quiet choices that shift everything over time. If you want to hear more stories like this as they continue, subscribe and stay with me.